Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those in Europe and the like. Welcome to our webinar, A New Post-COVID Economic Consensus for Latin America. I would just like to very much thank our collaborators for this event, particularly Columbia University Global Center's Santiago, and especially its director, Karen Poniachik. You can visit their website at globalcenters.columbia.edu/Santiago, as well as the ILAS at Columbia University, the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University. Their website is ilas.columbia.edu. We'd also like to thank the Institute for Stock Market Studies in Spain for their support of our event, and that's ieb.edu. And that center, Ramón Casilda is part of that center and is going to be with us here today. So just so you know, this event we've put it together because of an initiative that's been led by Ramón Casilda and José Antonio Ocampo, as well as 31 other economists and former public officials that published 18 recommendations for a new Latin American economic consensus, particularly in sort of the post-COVID era. If you'd like to download those recommendations, we do recommend that you go to iberoame, so iberoame.usal.es to download the recommendations. They are in Spanish, and they will be hopefully translated very soon to English and Portuguese, but for right now, you can visit that website and download the Spanish recommendations. So this webinar in particular, our hope is to examine with sort of the leaders of these recommendations to discuss the new policy paradigm and what that should look like. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers now. We have Ramón Casilda Béjar. He's professor at Latin American Studies Institute at the University of Alcalá, as well as professor at the Institute of Stock Exchange Studies in Spain. He was also the former director of the Santander Group School of Business Administration at Béjar University. We have with us Stephany Griffith-Jones, Director of Financial Markets Program in the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. She's also a professor emeritus at Sussex University. And José Antonio Ocampo, professor at Columbia University, as well as chair of the UN Committee for Development Policy, and former Minister of Finance of Colombia. We also have with us, obviously, your moderator for today, Ken Frankel, who's the president for the Canadian Council for the Americas.
Mil gracias, Marta, y bienvenidos los panelistas y todos nuestros amigos que están escuchando este webinar.
I usually don't begin a webinar, but saying, I'm sorry, but I do want to tell you that we're not going to be touching, but really we're not going to be touching something very important, which is Leonard, Messi, and James. No, but with the time we do have, I'd like to begin with Ramón. I'd like to begin with you as the creator of the idea of a new consensus with the collaboration of José Antonio and other academics. I mean, the first question is, why is it important to have consensus now in Latin America? Good afternoon and good morning and good afternoon to everybody that's with us. I'd like to firstly thank the Canadian Council for the Americas, Ken, Marta, José Antonio, of course, who's been the joiner of this conference. And I'd like to respond, but leaving open the question, because this is not a closed consensus at all. It's open, and even more now that it's just beginning to gather all of those formulations that will strengthen it. So answering your question, Ken, I studied like everybody, the Washington Consensus, the ideas that led John Williamson to make those 10 famous principles, the time when that consensus was developed. And with that, I tried to transfer to our time, to this very difficult time that we're experiencing. And although the consensus is a brand that has nothing to do with Latin America, the Washington Consensus, I think it's good to keep that word because it gives the idea of union, an idea of everybody rowing towards the same goals. And those goals undoubtedly are those that we all chase, which is better to improve really the welfare of countries of the region. So I thought it was possible to create a new consensus. However, with this new spirit, this new time, with new realities, with the pros and the cons, which are lived by the countries of Latin America. And with this perspective in mind, well, I began to think deeply, and I don't know if I created 15, 20 points, but really there were 18. And the purpose, if you look at the points that are the idea, I mean, the Washington Consensus talked about the didn't speak about SMEs or technology or infrastructure. So, well, wanting to be concise, I began with a preamble, like every document that gives a background about the economy of the region. And then I moved on to justify why the consensus, and that's what I'm doing now. And immediately when I started to describe all 18 points, and once I did, I gave it this title, always thinking of the time that we're living, of the specifics of the Latin American economy. I always looked at the productive network, the companies, the SMEs, the financing of SMEs, the financial culture within the population. So after that, I said, okay, what's good, what's bad? I've got to make somebody look at it. And I thought that the best person, the best acknowledgement, somebody that really knew about this in the region was my dear friend, José Antonio Ocampo. So I called him, and we've done different projects, initiatives together before. And I said, José Antonio, look, I've got this document. I want you to read it, consider it. I want to include it, to just read it all and let me know what you think about it. Initially, the items seemed okay. He made some minor adjustments. What was important is, but I got José Antonio to join me in this quote unquote adventure. Because remember, this is not a consensus like Williamson's for maximum prestige, and it was quote unquote, it was like the Washington Times. No, it just, and thanks to the support I received from José Antonio, I started to let this be known, because this had to start to be developed among governments and multilateral rank systems. And some of the items, not all of them, because it's impossible to think that all of them, I started to see that this body took place. It's an economic and social body that could adopt a model in a region and entitled 2020, the consensus 2020 post-COVID. And I stop here. I think Jose Antonio can give you a better vision for this. Thank you, Ramón. So, Jose Antonio, you were part of this process early on. As Ramón said, why did you incorporate to this consensus? And what's the goal? What's the hope that you have for this new consensus? Okay, Ken, thank you so much for your invitation, for being with all of you and with the network of the people that you work with today. Obviously, I would like to underline what Ramón said. He invited me, yes, to this task, and then we moved on the process of getting the supports, and with that, we started to enrich the text even more. So why do we think it's important? Because Latin America truly is experiencing a situation that's quite complicated. Firstly, because it's a region that's most hit by this crisis, along with Western Europe. Secondly, the crisis is creating social effects that are huge. I mean, according to the ECLA, we are going back 5 years or 10 years with regards to poverty reduction. Thirdly, it's because it rises after a very weak economic development period. And in the past 5 years, this, you could say it's the worst 5-year term after the Second World War in Latin America. And besides, the economic growth of the market reforms with the Washington Consensus has been more or less half, meaning 2.7% per year versus 5.5% that we had from 1950 to 1980 during the period of what we can call the industrialization. And lastly, and not least important, particularly because of the people related to political science that work with us. Because yes, we're having a democratic crisis in different countries. So that's a topic that's very important. We have to remember in Latin America, after 1979, during the 80s, became a region in the world with more democratic regimes. And that was a strength that we had in the region. But in this context, we collected 18 recommendations created by Ramón, by me, by different members of this group that supported us in this task. And briefly, we can look at these, and I would summarize them in 5 topics. First, developing social development, especially to struggle against inequality, which is a very serious problem in Latin America. And there are several recommendations on this subject matter. Second policy, the need of making a leap for productive development, for the performance that's quite weak that we've seen in the last 10 years or even 30, in which also there are many elements, but one that stands out, in my opinion, is to leap towards R&D. It's an area in which Latin America is really, really falling behind. I mean, Brazil invests more than 1% of its GDP for that. Last, to keep a good performance, a good macroeconomic performance. And I think it's most positive aspect that you can see from the Washington Consensus, although there are 2 items that we underscore: to be more active, preventing crisis, which is something we haven't done well under the Washington Consensus and with the strengthening direct foreign investment, which is good, especially for inequality. Fourth, to support international agreements, meaning the Sustainable Development Agreement from the UN, but also environmental agreements in which Latin America should play an important role. Firstly, to struggle against climate change, in which Latin America has to really look at deforestation. Remember, the Amazon is a source of Latin America, and also defending the Amazon is very important. Secondly, to protect biodiversity, which is very important because Latin America has the largest number of biodiverse countries worldwide. And lastly, but not least important, to defend democracy. The mechanisms of citizens' participation is important. And it's a way that we have to insert and develop democracy in the future, meaning we have to go back from the success of being the region that developed the most democracy. So that's my very brief answer to your question. Thank you. Thank you, Jose Antonio. Stephany, welcome. Before talking about the Washington Consensus, there are some items, or there are important items in the Washington Consensus that benefited, do you think, or are there things that can be saved still of it for now, or should we just leave it aside and move on to a new path? First of all, I'd like to thank your invitation to the CCA and the University of Columbia. It's a pleasure to be here with you, especially in such great company. Following the same line of Jose Antonio, I'd like to say that there are positive elements in the Washington Consensus, such as to insist on good macroeconomic policies. Besides, that has been positive for the region, although I think that we disagree with this consensus of Washington on how we can define it. For instance, the Washington Consensus, the orthodox view of the economy, really emphasizes on the balance to control that of the inflation, fiscal deficit. However, it considers something by economists, how can we call it? It's like a structure, it's orthodox. We also believe that the goal of the macroeconomic should begin with the production increase. And also something new is, and it's ecological sustainability, because we have limits in the planet. So we have to think and respect what the Washington Consensus says, but we also have to set our goals that featured in the post-war countries, the consensus that they had back then, which was to maximize employment. So I do believe that that is important, very important, and sustainability is key because the planet has limits. We can't go beyond it, what we have. So I think that we have to think for Latin America on the development, as Jose Antonio said, the performance of the Latin American economy, especially in the past 5 years, but overall has been quite poor, worse than any other region in developing countries. And the fall of this year, which is projected to be even worse than that of other regions developing in the world, helps me emphasize this. So we need a more dynamic model that will lead us to more development and more equalitarian, because last year, many countries, including where I lived many years, Chile, large social protests, very complicated phenomenon that showed the problem that Latin America has a lot of inequality and that the poorest people require better revenues, income. So we need a more dynamic, more equalitarian and sustainable development in Latin America. For this, I believe, and this is also a fallacy of the Washington consensus, we need, as José Antonio said, a clear, productive development model. And for it, we talk about different items. But for this, we need stronger states. So after the COVID, because urgently, we've seen that the states were called upon. Of course, we need states that work closely with the private sector, but we need it to be good leaders. And to do things well, I think that states need important tools of economic policies, because a problem with the Washington consensus is that if you leave everything in the hands of the market and you eliminate the government involvement and you tell the government says, I want to do this, but the government loses the tools to do it. So something that I've studied a lot, particularly, is, for instance, the National Development Banking. It's an instrument so that the governments can collect private resources, but with public banks, to channel public and private resources for investments in strategic sectors, so that strategic sectors can lead to a more dynamic development. And we have many examples, successful ones, like in Germany, like in China, South Korea. They've had significant national development banks that have helped in their own development. And lastly, if you allow me, and I agree with Joseph Stiglitz, I think it's necessary not only to have more tools and a new strategy, we need to change the rules of the game, meaning to enhance the unions and to regulate companies to avoid abuses, particularly to regulate finances, the private finance that has created so many problems, and also the ecology, so that we can facilitate quick transformation. So I think this is very important to have a productive development model, and in turn, to change the rules of the game, which are too in favor of the business groups, private sector, and the financial sector as well. And lastly, briefly, I'd like to say that the 5 areas highlighted by José Antonio are very important, but I would add one more, which is also part of the consensus, and it's to enhance Latin American integration. I think that we have a small market, and the future is to create economic scales and to make joint investments, joint investigations, research, technological developments among all of the countries in Latin America, like Europe has done, which particularly in the first decades of the European Union, the development was very quick. So those are my initial ideas, Ken. Thank you so much, Stephany. Okay, now with these initial remarks, now we can start talking about the 18 items and the 5 that stand out that José Antonio underscored. So Ramón, my question for you is, how can you put into operation the ideas of the 18 points? Are there policies, specific policies that you have in mind when you wrote down the consensus? I mean, the ideas sound great, but how can you put them into action? Can you talk about you can talk about any of the 18 items, or better, the 5 most important that Jose Antonio underlined. Okay, we can start with that. Let me focus on the 4+1. No, the 5+1, adding what Stephany added. There are 18, and it's good to focus on 5. So there's one that I would particularly like to underline, because it's like the vault where everything else lies. Latin America has an economic model based on exports of basic raw materials. So when the prices of raw materials and the demand increases, the GDP in Latin America rises. So initially we can ask ourselves 2 things. 1, it increases because it employs more labor. It doesn't increase because it's made through more innovation, which is the Korean model. Second, I'm very interested, especially, that this Latin American 2020 consensus will provoke or drive a new productive development model in Latin America to end because I think the current one is very fragile, very small, very atomized. We cannot have 99% of SMEs. It cannot have, in some countries, the informality cannot reach 70%. With that productive apparatus, the so-called 4th Industrial Revolution, and as Stephany said, in a globalization that will change and won't stop, we cannot compete. So it can't be that Latin America will stop its clock and continue with the same development model based on the production of basic commodities and exporting them, depending on the cycle of those commodities. So if Latin America wants to incorporate to the new, call it 4th Industrial Revolution, or the new era after COVID, which will be based on innovation and technology and processes and digitalization, it must find a new productive structure. So it has to change it. And for this, it's very important to keep in mind education. Let's not forget that everything has to do with technology, and innovation requires a lot of education. So with this productive system, I believe Latin America, that's why I talked about these 5 points. I think that Latin America would lose its place of the new industrial era. We have to be of course, I'm very aware that a productive system depends on every country, and you cannot change those models from one day to the other. It has to do with the politics, and everybody has to agree on using the same productive model to enhance the SMEs, the micro SMEs, and of course the large companies called multilatins. Otherwise, if we do not agree to an agreement to use the new productive model, I believe that everything else will not be with us. I mean, economies are dynamic. The world is still moving on. And if Latin America doesn't manage to incorporate to this progress, which is based on more productivity, more efficiency, more incorporation to the internationalization process, to talent, I believe that everything else won't be possible. We cannot create a state of welfare that's sound that's good, that will give way to equality, to social dynamics, to more progression, more fiscal progression that would make it possible to have better public utilities, better infrastructure. So again, we need more, we need a better education from the base. Without it, and this also, I think, deserves more cooperation between the public and private sectors. So it's state market. More now showing that in crisis, the market does need a strong state. It needs tools, for instance, what's showing with the crisis. Without the state, therefore, it's impossible to subsist this period in the market crisis. So I believe that it's necessary initially to reach this consensus, to continue advancing towards everything else and not the other way around, to agree on the other things without remembering who creates wealth and how it should be distributed. Thank you, Ramón. José Antonio. The same question for you. What specific policies can be proposed to put into action at least the 5 major parts of this consensus? There, you're mute. Yes. There are 18 recommendations, specific recommendations on policies, which are included in this consensus. And I gathered them into 5 large goals, but for each 18, there are specific recommendations, of course. And in any case, as Ramón already said, the idea is that this is a starting point, not the arrival point. I mean, this helps so that the internal processes of the democratic countries can help enrich in decision-making processes differently. For instance, everything has to be done in a different context. Now, there are many processes underway to begin the country where Stephany is from, Chile. And I mean, Chile, Stephany is binational, multinational, better. She's from Czechoslovakia and England and Chile. She's galactic. Yeah, but anyway, Chile has a referendum to create a new constitution, and that constitution will enrich the debate and of how to make politics in the economic, social, environmental aspects, and differently through different democratic processes. These 18 recommendations will be used differently, for instance, socially or productive policies. Stephany mentioned the role of development banks. Ramón mentioned R&D and the importance that Latin America really can be a leader technologically for its productive model ahead. But socially, for instance, yesterday we heard about education and healthcare, also to support a gender equality, ethnical equality in Latin America. So every topic can be seen, has its own recommendations. And I would add something, the environment. The environment, I mean, remember, Latin America is a leading region in the environment. It's no longer a large consumer greenhouse gases, but it has a historical responsibility towards this, and it's to protect the forests and to stop deforestation, which is an endemic problem in the Amazon and requires, for instance, a very particular support of all the countries in the Amazon basin. We've had an intense debate under the policies of President Bolsonaro in Brazil, but the other Latin American countries, for instance, in Colombia, Leticia, which is within the Amazon, gave a statement to protect the Amazon. And this is very important. And there are other forest areas that are important in southern Chile and in southern Argentina as well. And the boundary between Colombia and Panama, it's an area, it's one of the richest biodiverse areas of the world that we have in common in both countries. And again, this is related to biodiversity. So it's not something that frequently debated, but it is important. And lastly, internationally, I would talk about what Stephany mentioned, which has to do with the future of trade. And it's the role of integration, of economic integration. You can say that ahead, the uncertainty in international trade is huge. After the collapse that took place with this crisis, and the recovery, most uncertain, is seen now. How international trade will recover worldwide is huge. And that underscores the importance of the old idea in Latin America of the regional integration. This is something important, not only to promote trade, but also to promote productive development process in which we have several countries in regional value chains. And that's something very important, even more in terms of R&D, like Ramón mentioned. We have to see how we can make many R&D joint programs in Latin America, not only for economic reintegration, but we have a lot to learn from the European Union. The European Union has a big virtue that Latin America lacks, and it's that its integration process is respected by governments of the left and the right. In Latin America, we have different politicians, and when there's a different president, everything changes. Instead, the European Union has technological cooperation mechanisms, which is something that Latin America practically has nothing. So there are very interesting topics that we can learn from. So this is really a consensus for Latin America. I would say it's more Iberic America because of what Ramón and other colleagues from Spain have contributed. So I think that there's a learning stage there in Latin America to learn from what Europe has done. That's important. Thank you, José Antonio. I can see that there are many questions, so let's try to address them all. We've touched part of them during this discussion, but before we get to that point, Stephany, you're an expert in several things, yes, but especially in multilateral banks and national development banks. Could you talk to us briefly about the role of these banks to develop the topics mentioned in the consensus? Certainly, as I said before, I worked a lot in this with José Antonio in R&Ds, and we have a book on developments. And now I'm coordinating on a research for a forum that will take place in November with chiefs of state to promote development banking on a global, regional, national, multilateral phase. The idea is to heighten the profile of development banking. And why is it important? Firstly, because it can play a very important role counter-cyclic, meaning in the bad times, like these of the COVID or the financial crisis or the big debt of Latin American time, the banks can increase the banks while private banks decrease their loans. So these help to continue helping for the investments in essentials of the countries. And the loans are on a long-term basis to finance, for instance, the investigation of innovation, which Ramón and José Antonio have emphasized correctly. Also, they can finance infrastructure, especially now infrastructure, green infrastructure. José Antonio mentioned the importance of sustainability. I would add there the tremendous potential in the region in renewable energy. So you can do that only with private resources, but for instance, the experience of Germany and China shows that development banks can play a very important role to catalyze this, especially when investments, private investments, are timid in uncertain times, and also have an important role in inclusion to support SMEs, the regions that are most behind, and to support specific sectors. So the development banks could be a type of a mixed financial system, like the system that we had after the Second World War, more balanced, you could call it. Of course, we have the private banks that work with the development banks, but we should have a public national banking system. I said initially how we need instruments for public policies. Remember, these national banks work a lot with governments to design policies. And they're independent also, but they also work closely with the private sector, with businesses, to be able to deliver and channel the resources needed to the most strategic sectors, those that have the most impact to grow productivity, the economy, and to try to, for instance, to deliver projects in many different areas. And can you ask me about multilateral development banks? As José Antonio has said in other forums, we have discussed throughout Latin America the importance of increasing the capital of development banks, especially in our region. We have the IDB and the CAF, because as José Antonio said, recently, after the financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, there was an increase of capitals in these two banks. And that helped to recover the emerging countries. But that commitment has not been present. There are very few countries like Spain, for instance, that say that we need that expansion. That is key to help keep the investments in key sectors. Because what they do really, it's very good, but it's not enough. So we have a problem of how we can push that. I don't know if we have enough time, but I can talk about other tools, because really your question was about tools. One, as José Antonio said, the tools are to avoid what you call the boom bust, the boom, the falls that have been so volatile with capital flows. And for that, not only do you have to look at the cycle of fiscals, but also the exchange, the control of exchange rates to avoid the entrance of capitals that are euphoric, and to avoid that the capitals can be massively left out or outflowed. So I think that this is important because they provide a more stable exchange rate for exports that can have more value added. And for that, we need a competitive exchange rate. And the control of capitals is a tool for that. And it's an important lesson to learn from the Asian countries. They have featured the facilitation, that capacity of empowering the exchange rates, especially for products with that added value. Thank you, Stephany. I have several questions. We have several questions, so let's begin with them. Some are longer than others, but let me read them and let's see where we arrive. The first question is from John Price, and it says, fiscal deficits this year in Latin America will triple compared to last year. Balance sheets, development banks cannot cover the fiscal gaps of 2020 and 2021. Only a free market, the 100 companies that grow the most in Latin America, we only have one. So poverty is only we have in Peru and Chile enough resources to begin a strategy of expense, a counter cycle like consume. So with that background, this is the question. Do you think that populism will worsen in Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Central America? And if so, why is the private sector going to invest in the region? Well, that's the question, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, John, for your question. I don't know which one of you would like to answer. José Antonio, would you like to begin? Well, I think that's the challenge of democracies. Experiencing this situation, we do not want populism to prosper, not from the left or from the right, because populism does not provide solutions, good solutions, anywhere. So I think that that's the challenge that we have. And this is something that we referred to, of course, in the consensus. So the challenges are huge, yes, on that we do agree. But again, populism is not the solution. Ramón, would you like to, or Stephany? I entirely agree with José Antonio, especially that challenges are huge. For instance, developed countries have dramatically increased their fiscal deficit. The Monetary Fund estimates that we're talking about 16% of the GDP. We don't have the same fiscal space deficit. But when John asks about populism in the private sector, remember the private sector needs growth and employment. So it's difficult to satisfy both private and public sectors in these very difficult times. You have to maintain public expense, that's a given. But you have to do it in a reasonable, prudent way, well-channeled. And you have to look at investments and to finance, for instance, the Sustainable Development Fund in Chile which is a central left center, thinks that the deficit will reach 5% of the GDP. And also, I agree with José Antonio that populism is not only a left wing, because there are, for instance, Brazil is increasing a lot of its public policy. So you can't say Bolsonaro's from the left. So he's clearly making a right-wing populism. And in Mexico, which it's supposed to have a government that's progressive, more towards the left, has not increased fiscal expenses. So the growth has not been seen even before COVID. So no to populism, but yes to investments, proper investments. Ramón, would you like to add something? Or should we move on to the next question? No, let's move on to the next question. We have several about integration in Latin America. Let me read the question. It's from Carlos Portales. How can you enhance integration in Latin America if the processes go in different directions and diverge internally? For instance, in Mercosur, we have economies that diverge. Brazil is trying to open. Argentina is closing for many years. Uruguay is desperate for new markets, and it's difficult to have the external external tariff. The Pacific Alliance that looked towards the world reached a point that it stopped when Colombia did not accept opening it towards New Zealand, Australia, and then go through the CPTPE. Mexico basically is focused on North America. So that's the question about integration in Latin America. Ramón, would you like to answer? Let me give you a partial answer to this. When Europe, after 20 years, signed the agreement, then we had Mercosur, and we have news, as the gentleman asked the question. There's a disagreements among the same agreements in Mercosur between Argentina, Brazil. And there are some that say that they want to get out of Mercosur, which makes the Latin America integration as something very difficult, of course. Also, we have the Pacific Alliance. I remember when José Antonio initially mentioned that before that we had a glorious 10-year period, 2011, with the commodities, and it's when the multi-Latins expanded. I observed that through common projects of the companies in different countries, they provoked more integration processes, true ones, because of those projects of roads, communications, than the same projects that were on paper for 50 years. So more than the projects that all the blocks want to achieve, and José Antonio already mentioned this, we must make common projects on infrastructure, on IMAs, on our R&D, so that the integration process can be true, real, and give way to events that will them. Otherwise, it's very complicated because every country is going through the save yourself as you can, and it's not creating the integration that everybody's chasing. Before I forget, I would like to mention what Stephany talked about, the development banks. It's very important and it's passionate because development banking, there's a paradox there. The public, the KfW in Germany was founded with help from the Marshall Plan. Can you believe it? What's Marshall Plan? And now this bank is the most important German bank. And I think it's one of the top in Europe. And simply, I think the others have disappeared. In Spain, we have a big development bank, which, by the way, is helping to refinance the government, especially for SMEs, along with the private sector and private banking system. So we have to update the development banking systems to create new productive realities, which are submitted in the companies. Remember, businesses do not compete regionally, they compete internationally. So we have to be very careful with the development banking to stop thinking backwards to finance something on a long-term basis, projects, because those projects have to have a return, an efficiency, more productivity, especially that's important. So the development banking, the consensus really is a priority for us as a tool for economic policies in Latin America. That's it. Thank you, Ramón. Jose Antonio, would you like to say something? I would like to highlight the topic of integration. There's a success case in Latin America that very few people mentioned, and it's the common Central American market, the smallest countries. This entity went through the terrible experience during the civil wars in the 70s, but after the 90s, it was rebuilt and it's stable. And it's the only common market that we have in Latin America. So there are political differences, significant ones between the countries, yes, but that doesn't stop them from having good trade. So there is an interesting history that we should keep in mind. In the question of Uruguay, when you mentioned Uruguay in the question, Uruguay, I mean, it has had a really tough time, but Uruguay did agree, regardless, and with other countries, regardless political differences, because integration is important. And Uruguay, obviously, is a potential winner, such as Paraguay, which is part of the process, to prosper in trade. I remember Uruguay exported more than half of its products to Brazil or Argentina. And no matter what, in the Andean community, we do have successful cases. For instance, Bolivia has played well in the integration with Evo Morales, unlike another government that likes the ideas of Evo Morales that broke away. And Bolivia has, I mean, the trade between the 4 members of the Andean community that are still in operation, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, is a trade that's quite integrated internally, although there are very deep differences on their economic relations with third countries. But that's a topic. But but that's important, so important. But between them, the trade is very, very good. For instance, Colombia or Bolivia exports a lot of soy to Colombia, and it's done it for 30 years. And it hasn't been a process that has any problems of being restricted anytime soon. Thank you, Jose Antonio. Now we have reached the end of the hour. If the panelists can stay a few minutes more, let's try to answer another questions. Would you, just a minute, because I'd like to talk about what Jose Antonio said. I'd like to say, I agree. The Central American market is great, and something is key there. There's a project that's emblematic that shows what I said before, and it's CIAPAC. CIAPAC, remember, in the 90s, a power company, Endelsa, proposed the so-called common cable for the electrical integration of Central America. It was known as the CIAPAC system, the integration of Central America. So all the countries agreed. There was one financer, Stephany, you know that well, which was the IDB. And they took 10 years to define this project, this common project for the integration, which today there's the common inter-regional power market. So a private sector, a company proposed a project with the multilateral banking, with technical assistance from the IDB and the company. And there's a reality today, which is this electrical interconnection in Central America. So projects can be done, public-private, with the multilateral banking systems for more productivity, for more benefits for all these countries, and to enhance the integration process. It could be perhaps Mercosur, where the Pacific Alliance can find similar projects to really enhance the integration. I wonder, because the governments don't start anything. And I think we need more of that public-private sector integration to drive the integration process in Latin America. Thank you, Ramón. There are several questions from Gabriel Silva. Let me choose one. The conservation and protection of the environment has a significant cost, which competes with the assignment of resources to social aspects. Does the consensus have a proposal of how to make that conservation as an investment and a compensation item? The balance of resources. Jose Antonio, would you like to answer? Well, I don't think it competes in any way with social policy. I mean, because really most of the topics of the environment are regulatory. And when it comes to the protection of ecosystems, what is important, I must stress, is how we develop economic and social policies for people that live in the areas that are protected. And something that's very important for every country in South America is the fact that there are indigenous populations that are very important in those ecosystems, not only in the Amazon, but also in the south of Chile. So the manner of incorporated our principles to protect ethnic groups also has to do with the benefits that give for the indigenous groups. I mean, there are additional specific topics that we can mention. One that's key is how biodiversity can be used productively, not destroying it, but instead benefiting from it. Even with traditions, for instance, the increased use of some vegetables for medicine or for beauty products. These are interesting topics. And something important is the strong defense that this cannot be patented by foreign companies or any private company, because these are resources for communities, those that live in those ecosystems. Thank you. I'd like to say that items 6 and 16 of the list collect what's indicated in that question. Thank you, Ramón. Stephany? I would like to add, I believe not necessarily the future lies on the economic structure that we have. For instance, fossils probably will turn into stranded assets, meaning assets with less value because the price of coal will increase. There are a lot of environmental regulation because the governments are committed to reduce the CO2 emissions. And the future of work is created of new employment has to do with green jobs, such as renewable energy, electrical cars, or electrical mobility. And there, our region has a lot of possibilities, like Chile and Argentina have lithium. So so will lithium be developed by foreign companies, or can it have more value added nationally or regionally? That would be great. So I think it's very important to think that the reality that we have today of fossil fuels, especially those that sell it and export it, like coal, like oil, will see a decrease. So we need productive developments in other activities that will be more commercial, much more green. I heard the question, for instance, in Chile, if copper can be increasingly produced with greener technologies, and if that copper could be more expensive because of that, for instance. Thank you, Stephany. We cannot answer all of your questions. We have 2 more. So let's try to answer them. And with that, remember, this is not the last webinar we'll be holding on this topic. We will be following this topic closely. So if we cannot answer those questions today, you'll have more opportunities to ask them again, and even more. So with this, there is a question from Giorgio Trentinello. Says, what are the proposals that you would propose to get out of such a deep unemployment rate and for the next months and for 2021? Obviously, this is something hot. Who would like to answer that question? I can answer what I propose for Colombia. This is not part of the consensus, of course, but the consensus does underscore the importance of employment and formalization of employment, especially with having benefits. And these are principles that are in the OIT. Colombia has one of the worst cases in Latin America in terms of employment. The unemployment rate in Colombia is the highest in Latin America at 20%. I have been proposing a mix of different alternatives. The first alternative is a subsidy for employment. Indeed, the Colombian government is already giving an employment subsidy to protect employment, and that subsidy should remain, but related to creations of jobs. And it can be done differently as well. For instance, through loans from the Colombian development banks, which are partially non-reimbursable according to the jobs created. That gives capital to the companies for their recovery. That's an alternative. And another thing I proposed is a special employment emergency program. This mechanism was used in Chile during the crisis it experienced during the 80s, and then it was also used in Colombia during the 90s. And these are specific plans guided towards one of the groups mostly hit, which are women. For women, infrastructure programs are not very helpful. So they need more community support programs, especially for women. These are some of the ideas that I proposed for the Colombian scenario. Okay, thank you, Jose Antonio. I think that with that question, Ramón, Stephany, would you have something else to add at your last remarks? Just to back what Jose Antonio said, in the European context, including Great Britain, but especially Germany and France, there's an employment subsidy that's very high. They pay companies 80%, especially the development banks, with collaterals to maintain their workers. Indeed, in Germany and France, they just renew it for 2 more years. I think that that's very interesting because the Germans have taken a very different position with this COVID, a very expansive fiscal policy and oriented especially to keep the jobs. As Jose Antonio said, the Colombian experience, I think is very important. I think that countries like Chile have been much more limited. They've had many problems in this case. It's key, really, to keep companies with future, to keep the jobs. And we believe that they're sustainable because if not, there's a destruction of the productive capacity, but also the human capacity. Thank you, Stephany. Ramón, you have the last word for today. I didn't want to have this honor, but well, you started, you had the first, so you had the last. There's a symmetry here. Just to complement what Stephany said, in Spain, Europe had a common posture. Really, Germany is no longer has an austerity policy. Spain has also created a similar program in which 80%, as was said, of the loans of 200,000 million euros are backed by the state through the collateral that's given by the public bank. The other 20% is backed by the private banking system, which is the one that provides the loans, especially to SMEs, of course, and what we call the autonomous workers, freelancers. The idea is not to destroy jobs, create the demand, maintain the demand, so that which we know has fallen intensely. Thank you, Ramón. Thank you, Ramón, José Antonio, Stephany. Thank you for our interpreter, Gloria Mejia. And all of our guests today. As I said before, we couldn't answer all of your questions, but also we will make a follow-up of this topic, and we all will have the chance to ask these questions again and even more. So with this, I'd like to thank again our partners, Columbia University, the Center in Santiago, ES in Colombia, and IDB in Spain, IED. On behalf of the Canadian Council for the Americas, I wish you a good afternoon and a good evening for others. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you, Ken. Thank you for everything, Ken.